Hey everybody, welcome back to Horror Trans. My name is Stephanie Bree. I'm a transgender woman who talks about all things horror. And this is not a new video series I'm going to do, but this is a type of video I've done in the past. And I wanted to do something a little bit different because I want to answer a question that has been bugging me since roughly 1988, give or take. The question is, how big is Springwood, Illinois, as depicted in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise? And I don't mean, like, big as in, how well known is it in the national ethos, because it is, obviously. I mean, like, population estimate. How many people live in Springwood? Is it a small town? Is it a mid-sized town? Is it a big city? Is it a suburb of a city? I'm not going to try to pinpoint geographically where it's located because that would be impossible based on the information in the movie. But I do think I can definitively make a strong case that Springwood is much bigger than people think it is. So, let's look at the evidence based on what we see location-wise in the film first before we get into the lore and the backstory. So, in A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984, we see the high school, which is a really big high school. I would estimate somewhere between 400 to 600 student population, which does tip it over the scale of mid-sized city at the bare minimum. Because no town of 10,000 people is going to have a high school with 400 to 600 kids in it. They don't have the there's just not enough kids for a high school that big. So we can assume it's at least 30,000 people based on the size of the high school as depicted in the films. But I think it's bigger than that, and I can get to it. In Nightmare on Elm Street 2, now, back up for a second. We do see the police station in A Nightmare on Elm Street 1, and it's not a very big police station. So your assumption would be, oh, it must be a small to mid-sized city, right? No, because there's no evidence that that is the police station in town. It's just a police station in town, and big cities have multiple police stations. So we could theorize that that's just one precinct in Springwood. There's no proof that that is the only police station in Springwood. Now, we can prove this definitively because if you watch Freddy vs. Jason, that's an entirely different building with an entirely different facade, a different layout, different uniforms. The police have different looking cars, and you could try to make a case that, well, I mean, 1984 police department's not going to look anything like a 2003 police department. Except for if you actually go year by year and follow the in-universe timeline, Freddy vs. Jason cannot take place in 2003. Neither can A Nightmare on Elm Street take place in 1984. There's some anachronisms that we have to sweep under the rug. But also you have to account for the fact that 6 years' time passes between Nightmare on Elm Street 1984 and Nightmare on Elm Street 3 1987, which is only 4 years in real world time. No, 3 years. That's only 84 to 87 is 3 years in real world time, but 6 years in the movie. But we're not talking about that. Let's talk about the Dream Clinic. A Nightmare on Elm Street 1984 has a dream clinic. A research facility dedicated to studying dreams. You are not going to find a facility of that nature in a small town. We can rule that out. It would be impossible. There would not be enough scientists in that community to support a research facility. There would not be enough grant money from a small town to financially support a research facility of that nature. So we can guarantee it's not a small town. We can rule that out just from the evidence we see in 1984, Elm Street. Then you look at 1985, Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, and all of a sudden it looks like a small town again. The high school as depicted in that movie is not as big of a campus as the high school is depicted in the previous film. It's a smaller campus. Also, we see a little bit of the downtown. And what we see in the downtown is we see a gay bar. Well, an S&M bar that also serves homosexual community. You're not going to find a community-specific S&M bar that caters to a kink crowd that's also welcoming to the LGBT community in 1985 in small town, is it Illinois or Ohio? I can't remember. But you're not going to find that. So again, that is further evidence that it has to be, at minimum, a mid-sized city, which would put it in the 30 to 60,000 population range. But you're asking yourself, what about that small high school? Again, if we're in a bigger city, you're not only going to have multiple police precincts, you're going to have multiple high school campuses, which would make sense when you look at, one, the fact that every movie depicts a different looking high school, which you could chalk up to a continuity error, or this movie takes place at this high school, and the next movie takes place at a totally different high school across town. This is further supported by the fact that none of the kids know any of the previous kids. So, in Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, they're talking about events that took place, I want to say 5 years ago, in the past. If you were going to the same high school that Nancy Thompson and Tina Gray went to, you would have known about Tina Gray's murder. There is no way you went to that high school for the next at least 25 years and don't know who Tina Gray is. Because she was a high-profile murder victim in allegedly a small town. If it is a small town, by the time you get to 1985, Freddy's Revenge, everybody in the school already knows who Tina Gray is. There's a memorial to her somewhere in the school. There's probably a college scholarship in her honor. It would be impossible for a small town to have a high-profile murder victim not be memorialized and everybody in town know who she is. That would be impossible. It doesn't happen. If it's a big town, 50 to 60,000, 70,000 people, maybe the students in Freddy's Revenge, again, are going to a different campus. They would know who Tina Gray is because that happened across town at a different school. Maybe they heard about her, but they probably wouldn't know her name. They wouldn't know the circumstances around her murder, so they could theoretically be shocked to learn of her murder. Now we can go a step further. Let's look at Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, which was filmed and released in 1988, but depending on how you calculate the internal timeline, should take place in 93 or 97, somewhere in that ballpark. It's a pretty big stretch, but it's at least early to mid-90s. Those kids would still know who Tina Gray is if they were going to the same high school she went to. They would know who Jesse was. They would know who Will Stanton was. They would know these kids because there would be a memorial, a whole wall with their photographs and yearbook pictures and obituaries commemorating them in the high school. Unless it's a big city and this is just par for the course. If Springwood's population is 100,000 plus, everything makes a lot more sense. First of all, in a city that big, you would have multiple bars downtown or sprinkled throughout town. Some of them catering to, different crowds, S&M crowds, LGBT crowds, etc. The junkies, the high, higher society. You would have that. But now you have to backtrack to something that one of the adults, and I cannot remember all of their names, so forgive me, but I believe it was Dr. Gordon, who said, this is the best Thai food in Springwood, but also it's the only Thai food in Springwood. Again, your assumption is, well, if they only have one Thai food restaurant, it must be a small town or a mid-sized city. Not necessarily. If you're in the Midwest, presumably Ohio or Illinois, we haven't pinpointed the geography yet, but we'll brush that aside. There might not be a very big Thai population in 1987 in that city. In the 1980s, Thai food was not commonplace outside of cities that had Thai populations or heavy Asian populations. So just because it's a big city doesn't mean it can't have only one Thai restaurant. I've been to big cities that had 0 Korean barbecue restaurants. That doesn't mean it's a small town. It just means that market isn't interested in Korean barbecue. If we assume every high school that we see in all 6 of the mainline films are different campuses spread around town, that alone not only supports the hypothesis that it is 100,000 plus population, because you would have multiple high schools, different sizes of child population, different sizes of campuses, that would also very easily explain why kids on the south side don't know who Tina Gray is if she lived on the west side. Now, we do know that the kids, as depicted in Nightmare on Elm Street 1984, are upper middle class white kids. But we also know that the kids in Nightmare on Elm Street Dream Master 1988 are lower middle class kids. We see their bedrooms, we see their houses. They have working, except for Kristen, they have working class parents. They have regular homes. These are not rich kids. But the kids in the first movie aren't necessarily rich kids, but they are upper middle class. They're definitely in a wealthier school district than the kids in Dream Master. This would also explain Rick's throwaway comment where he said, hey, have you looked at our town's history? Town's history, not school's history. It's not necessarily a safe place to be a teenager. This would back up the theory that, yeah, it's a bigger city. Furthermore, in addition to the Dream Clinic, which a small city would not have, they also have a very big hospital. Very big hospital. So big that it has an abandoned, shut down mental health ward separate from the fully functional, fully operational mental health ward that, as depicted in Dream Warriors, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, 1987, has a pretty robust sized campus and staff. We see literally hundreds of people walking around on campus in the background in various shots. Too many for it to be a small hospital. Way too big of a hospital for a small town. In addition to the sizes of the high schools. Now, we don't see any elementary schools outside of one elementary school in Freddy's Dead. We could chalk that up to a legacy elementary school in an underfunded part of town that never kept up with the times. Well, of course, that's the entire town as depicted in that film, but let's just put a pin in that for a second. Then you have So you have the Dream Clinic, you have the mental health hospital, and then you have the normal, regular, just regular hospital. But you have the comment where she says there is no children's ward. So, we're back to it must be a small town because a big city hospital would have a children's ward. Not necessarily. A big city hospital might not have a children's ward because it has an entirely separate, dedicated children's hospital somewhere else in city limits, somewhere else. That would very easily explain why there's no children's ward, because if it's a mid-sized town, 50, 60,000 people, or a smaller city, 20 to 40,000 people, if that's the all-in-one hospital, mental health clinic, dream clinic, presumably, standard hospital, it would have a children's ward. 100% it would have to have a children's ward. Otherwise, when you have a child murderer like Freddy Krueger running around slashing children, where are you sending those victims to get stitched up? Even if you don't have Freddy Krueger, kids get bumps and scrapes, they get the measles and mumps and, the flu and pneumonia and everything else. You gotta have a dedicated children's wing in your hospital, otherwise kids are going to die in your town. Well, if you have a hospital as big as the campus we see as depicted in Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, which is a pretty big hospital, again, that could theoretically be an entirely separate hospital from the one we see in Dream Warriors, and an entirely separate hospital from what we see in 84 with the Dream Clinic, which means there's at least 3 massive-sized hospitals with hundreds of staff and presumably hundreds of patients. We could hypothesize very accurately that there's presumably a comparable-sized children's hospital somewhere in town, which again supports the theory that it's a 100-plus population. Now let's go back to Freddy versus Jason. Now, in the timeline, I know there are flashbacks to Freddy's dead, but Freddy vs. Jason cannot take place after Freddy's dead. It can't. For 2 reasons. One, the dystopian town that we see in Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare, there's not enough time between 1993 and 2003, which is 10 years, to repopulate the town, brainwash all the kids, and cover up Freddy and the town's history and the town's past, all the way to what we see in 2003's Freddy vs. Jason. Even if we assume it's 2070, there's still not enough time to repopulate the town and bury the history. The Freddy lore is too pervasive in town. I mean, you have a prolific, high-profile serial killer like Freddy Krueger. Even if you're only going by what is his confirmed kills while he was alive, which they said was 20 to 30 kids in the neighborhood. 20 to 30 kids. Again, they said in the neighborhood. They didn't say in the city. They said in the neighborhood. So we could assume Freddy Krueger only killed kids in his general vicinity, which, if it's a big enough city, 100 to 200,000 people, they would have known Freddy Krueger was a monster and he existed, but they probably would have gone out of their way to protect kids from that information. Which makes more sense if Springwood is a big city, 500,000 plus. Because at that population size, you now have a big enough city that it is not only plausible, but very believable that you could have whole entire swaths of the community that have never heard of Tina Gray, or Freddy Krueger, or Nancy Thompson, or any of the countless victims of those films. Because if it's big enough, 400, 500,000 people, shit, people are getting killed every day. Every day. You're probably talking 50 to 60 deaths a day in a city that size. Probably 3 or 4 murders a month. At that size of a population, a singular child murderer from the 1970s who only killed 20 to 30 kids in this one part of town could presumably be lesser known in the population as a whole, if the town did, in fact, do their best to either cover it up, which we see evidence of this, as well as protect the kids from it, which we see evidence of this as well. If, in fact, the news media, as well as the police force and the mental health facilities are all, let's just say, in cahoots with one another to cover up this fact, we see evidence of this as well in Freddy vs. Jason, but we also see hints at it throughout the franchise because we see no news reports at all. Glenn was murdered in a brutal fashion. Brutal murder. Inexplainable to the first responders. They could not explain what did that to him. In a small town or a small city of 100,000 or smaller, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people, every news station in a 50-mile radius would be there live reporting on that murder. Every single one of them. The newspapers would be there. The off-brand newspapers would be there. The newspapers from, like, every town within 100 miles would be there reporting on this. We see no news media covering Glenn's murder. Now, we do know that there is a television station covering the murders because we saw them covering Tina Gray's murder earlier in the film. So we do know the news media was at least interested enough in Tina's murder to cover it. But why were they not interested in Glenn's murder? Either, well, this is a pattern, there's too many murders, so they don't see the connection, or there's not enough murders, they don't see it as news. No, that wouldn't make sense. It would have to be too many murders for them to see it as news. Or again, they don't see a pattern, so they're not connecting the dots. Or we could chalk it up to, we're seeing the early responders, getting to the scene. The news media hasn't shown up yet. Now, I'm here to give you first-hand experience. When I worked in the news business, we listened to the scanner. If you hear a call, first responders go to this address because a teen was murdered, you're going to get there before the first responders do. I guarantee it. I always did. I was always on scene before the sheriff was. Always. A good news reporter in a sizable market is going to be able to do that. But if it's a population of 500,000, thereabouts, plus or minus, the news, Tina Gray's death might have been high profile because she's a young, wealthy, blonde, teenager. That made the news. Glenn, well, maybe that wouldn't make the news because it's like, well, it's just a teenage boy. I know that's dismissive, but that is often how it happens. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed 15-year-old girl being murdered is more likely to be news than a 17-year-old boy. If you're in a big enough city that death and murder is commonplace, which we see evidence of this throughout the film franchise, that there are enough murders. Now, we do hear a news report in Dream Warriors on the radio that says another series of teenagers or something to that effect. and experts are at a loss. So we do know that the news media is at least marginally following the story of a pattern killer or pattern suicides as it is depicted in the film. A bunch of kids killing themselves, and experts are at a loss. Again, this would make sense if it's a big city because, yeah, there would be ongoing reports, but it wouldn't be making the news every single news cycle because after a while people are like, oh yeah, another kid killed themselves. That's not news anymore. If you have a string of like 4 or 5 suicides in the span of like a couple of months, you're going to be following that regularly as it's happening. But the timeline is 6 or 7 years between Elm Street 84 and Elm Street The Dream Warriors. 6 or 7 years, give or take. Now it has become a pattern. At this point, yeah, people are still, it's an alarming trend, but it's no longer breaking news when it happens because it's so commonplace. People have become numb to it. We see this in the real world with mass shootings. School shootings and mass shootings happen every day in this country. But it has to be an exceptionally newsworthy occurrence before the national media gives a shit. Right? So we see evidence of this. Well, the national media has lost interest in the story because, that's Springwood. Kids are killing themselves every day there. Experts can't figure it out. There's nothing more to report. There's no new information to report. You're beating a dead horse at this point. Which is why the local, presumably AM or FM radio station would have an update like, yeah, another string of suicides. And now let's talk football. That's sort of the tone I got from, even though we only get a snippet of the newscast, that's sort of the tone I got. Which again would make sense in a big city where this is happening so regularly, the general public has lost interest. Which would explain why the kids in Dream Master and Dream Child, 4 and 5 respectively, might not know about the suicides all the way on the other end of town. Because it wouldn't have personally affected them. They wouldn't have known anybody about it. But wait, you say, what about the Crave-In Diner? That's a very small diner. It's a very small town 50s diner. Okay, yes, that could be evidence of a small town setting. Except, big cities have small town diners downtown, sprinkled throughout the town. You could go to Los Angeles, which is a mega city, and find a small town 50s diner that looks like the Crave-In, smack dab in the middle of one of the largest cities in the world. That is not evidence it's a small town. Contrary, that's actually evidence of it being a big city. And I say this because it's not like every kid in town is hanging out at that diner. We only see evidence that it's just Alice and her small group of friends. We see Dan show up and a few other kids, but everybody else, presumably, is going to McDonald's or Wendy's or Taco Bell or whatever. And we can back this up with the fact, 2 points I've already previously made. One, the size of the high school as depicted in both of those films, Dream Warrior or Dream Master and Dream Child respectively, is big enough that there's no way the entire high school population is just eating at that one diner. We see evidence of this by the fact that, yeah, there's only a small group of kids that are eating at that outdated 50s diner. And who are those kids? The football jocks. Why? Because football jocks in general tend to be more community focused, right? They're conditioned to that. we see Dan wearing a Letterman jacket, right? A very vintage, old-school looking Letterman jacket. It would make sense that the football jock would want to patronize presumably some sort of staple in his community, local restaurant that has a history, versus just going to McDonald's. Another piece of the puzzle is we never see a shopping mall in any of the films. You could theorize there is no shopping mall. It's too small of a town. But I've already debunked that. That can't be the case. So we can go a step further and we can assume there is a shopping mall somewhere in town. It's just not geographically relevant to the kids we're following. I mean, you're talking kids that are going from house to school and then school to cemetery. There's no time in their lives while their friends are being murdered and they're just trying to survive. They don't have time to go to the shopping mall and get an Orange Julius and pop into, I don't know, Spencer's Gifts. They've got more important things to focus on right now. We never see a Walmart, a Kmart, or any department store in town. But we do know, just based on ancillary evidence, that there has to be more than one department store in town, even though we never see it. We never see a McDonald's in town, but we can assume there's at least 7 or 8 of them floating around. We just don't see it because it's not important to the story that we're following. We don't ever see a grocery store depicted in these films, ever. But we know definitively there has to be at least one grocery store in town because the town's too big to not have a grocery store, regardless of what population it is. Because any town of 1,200, as small as 1,200 people up, is going to have a grocery store. It's going to. Even if it's a small and one mom and pop type grocery store that's also a gas station and also a, bar or local restaurant, whatever. We don't see any evidence of that. So we can assume, quite with a fair degree of confidence, there must be supermarkets in town. And I'm saying plural, as in multiple. There's probably a Kmart and a Sears and a Macy's and a Walmart and a Target and everything else. And tons of grocery stores. IGAs and Kroger's and Albertsons or whatever they had back in the day. We just don't see them because they're not necessary for the plot. Again, the kids aren't going out of their way to go grocery shopping when their best friend was murdered 2 days ago. Also, we're following teenagers. By and large, especially in the 80s and 90s, teenagers weren't grocery shopping anyways. Theoretically, the parents, or in the case of the upper middle class students, the hired help, would have been doing the grocery shopping, not the teenagers. So just because we don't see a Walmart, a shopping mall, a McDonald's, or a grocery store doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that we never see them. Now, we see, I know it's a dream sequence, but we see Dan going from the swimming pool, indoor swimming pool, pretty good sized indoor swimming pool, could theoretically be a YMCA or something equivalent, could be a city pool. We don't get confirmation. We do know it's not the school because they're giving the keys to one of the students to lock up after shift. If it was a school swimming pool, she wouldn't be working there on shift. It would just be, there would be a coach or a student advisor or a teacher or somebody on staff, on faculty there to supervise. We don't see that. So we can very accurately, with a high degree of confidence, assume that's a private entity because she works there and she's locking up. And it's a pretty good sized facility. Now, we also know that one of the students, I think her name was Lisa, has a private pool somewhere in town. So we at least know that the town's big enough to have a rich kid with a private pool. At least one rich kid with a private pool. Based on what we see Dan driving from the swimming pool to the Craven Diner, one, we see he's driving on a 4-lane highway, a divided highway, which you're not going to have a highway that big running through that big of a stretch of town if it's a small town. It would be a 2-lane road. He would have made that trip in like 4 or 5 minutes tops. Again, I'll grant that what we see is a dream sequence, but we also see evidence of divided highways in other films. And we see traffic in the distance, off in the distance, in Elm Street 3, Elm Street 4, and Elm Street 5. And again, we see the size of the ambulance. And we can look at just looking at the ambulance on scene, on location, at every one of the deaths. Well, we know murders, but we'll say deaths. It's a different ambulance. And some of them are depicted in a more modern, high-tech, high-quality, higher-budget ambulance than other ambulances. Which goes back to the theory that this is a big city. The first response, the emergency, the EMS station or the fire station or wherever the ambulance is parked that's responding to Glenn's neighborhood might be a completely different EMS station or fire station than the ambulance that's responding to I forgot her name, but the girl with the asthma in Dream Master. That's a different ambulance, which again suggests multiple EMS stations with different budgets respectively, which again further backs up that this has to be a big city, because there would be the lesser neighborhoods don't have the budget to fund their first responders, but a richer neighborhood would, because that's how cities allocate their budgets. The rich white kids are going to have a fancier neighborhood EMS ambulance than the middle class kids or the lower income kids on the south side of town. That is exactly how cities operate. Further suggesting easily a population of 500,000 or more, based on the fact that they have multiple medical facilities. Again, a mental health clinic, a general hospital, presumably a dedicated children's hospital, and a dream research clinic. You're not going to have a dedicated dream research clinic unless you have at least 200,000 people in your city. Because again, you don't have the finances to support it, and you don't have the scientific community to populate the staff. People aren't going to live in a city that there's no jobs for them. All of this, again, without getting into the geography or the timeline, because that gets muddy, that's a whole other video. I can definitively say with a high probability that the smallest Springwood, either Ohio or Illinois, depending on which film you're watching, or even California, depending on some, the smallest population is 500,000. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's probably closer to 700,000 or 800,000, just because the kids in Dream Child have no idea who Tina Gray is. And she only died in the same high school they went to 6 years ago. No. They would know who she is, and again, like I said, there would be a shrine to her somewhere in that campus. They would have known who she is. But they don't. because she was presumably in a campus on the other side of town they have no knowledge of, no connection to, no personal interaction with. That makes sense. Also, we see a pretty good sized, very robust city park in The Dream Master that we don't see in any other films. A small town would not have a city park with those kind of amenities. They just wouldn't. Now, we do know the exact city park where that was filmed, and that is in Los Angeles because we know where they filmed. But we can sweep that under the rug because it's a movie. But still, you're not... A town of 60,000 people is not going to have a city park that looks like that. They're going to have a swing set, a jungle gym, and a sandbox. And not much else. Maybe a pavilion, maybe some park benches and trees. That's it. That's it. City parks aren't that nice in small towns. Because again, they don't have the budget for it. We also see in Freddy vs. Jason, not only is that a very big police campus compared to the other police stations we've seen depicted throughout the film, but you can look around and spot evidence that that's a high-tech, high-budget police station compared to the low-tech, low-budget police station that Nancy's dad works at in the first film. Again, that cannot be the same police station. The timeline doesn't fit. And if your city is big enough to have multiple police stations, multiple shopping malls, presumably, multiple, at the very least, medical facilities, including a dream research clinic, which you would not have in a small city, period. You just won't. We can assume that it's at minimum 500 to 600,000, and I'm going to guess closer to 700,000 or 800,000 people. And this is without even getting into Wes Craven's New Nightmare, because again, that's Los Angeles. That's a whole separate thing. Now, you're going to say, what about Freddy's Dead? Okay, you're going to make the argument that there's no way that in a 10-year time span, enough kids died or killed themselves that the entire economy would collapse. That's not plausible. Well, first of all, I'm going to say you're talking about a movie that has a dream demon that can manipulate reality at will. So if you can't accept anything at this point, you've lost track of the premise of the film. However, we can chalk it up to we don't know that the Springwood that we see in Freddy's Dead is the real Springwood. There is ample evidence within the film itself that the entire movie takes place within the dream. And we know Freddy is very proficient at manipulating the dream. So we could assume that everything we see in Freddy's Dead is entirely a dream. And there is ample evidence of this. Ample evidence of this. So the real Springwood probably hasn't changed from Dream Child to Freddy vs. Jason, which again, if you take Freddy's Dead out of the timeline and try to put it after Freddy vs. Jason, it don't work because we see flashbacks to Freddy's Dead in Freddy vs. Jason, which again further supports the theory that Freddy's Dead, at least the scenes that take place in Springwood, are just a dream. This is evidenced by the fact that Spencer is bopping around with no gravity and falls through a hole in the floor that doesn't exist in reality. Evidenced by the fact that they're driving in a circle and they keep showing up back at the same exact statue no matter which road they take in town. Something that would only happen in a dream. And we see him actually turn the house that they enter into his house, which he could not do if they were awake. He could only do that if they were in the dream. So I will argue that Freddy's Dead is not evidence that it's a small town. Freddy's Dead, the entire movie, is just a dream. This is further supported by the fact that there's no daytime in Freddy's Dead, except for when they first arrive, and that's only because that again is Freddy manipulating the reality around them to convince them, yeah, sure, this is what's happening. All of this is for me to say everything I've said up to this point is purely speculative. Nobody can say definitively, but I think there's strong evidence for Freddy's Dead was a dream. Springwood is a major city of over 500,000 people. And the timeline doesn't make a lick of sense, no matter how you slice it. Stay cool.